The slap echoed through Coastal Kitchen like thunder splitting the night sky. It was 7:23 p.m. on their third wedding anniversary when Vivian Grace Morrison's world shattered with the sound of her husband's palm connecting with her cheek. The wire-rimmed glasses she'd worn since college clattered across the marble floor, their metallic scrape silencing 50 witnesses who had come for Pacific Coast cuisine, and instead witnessed something that would haunt their social media feeds for weeks. Vivian sat frozen 7 months pregnant with the kind of glow that pregnancy magazines promised but stress had dulled. Her hand moved instinctively to her reddening cheek as the baby inside kicked frantically, responding to the surge of adrenaline coursing through her system. She had felt this before, the way her unborn child seemed to sense danger even from within what should have been the safest place in the world. Charles Edward Whitmore III straightened his Italian silk tie and reached for his wine glass as if nothing had happened. At 38, he carried himself with the confidence of old money and Ivy League entitlement, a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His steel-gray eyes held no remorse, only irritation that she had forced his hand. "Pick them up," he commanded in the same tone he used with subordinates at his investment firm. "And stop making that pathetic face. People are staring." The upscale restaurant had fallen eerily quiet except for the soft jazz playing over hidden speakers and the gentle crash of waves against the rocks outside. Coastal Kitchen sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, its floor-to-ceiling windows normally offering breathtaking views that made this the most sought-after reservation in town. Tonight, those windows reflected the stunned faces of diners recording with trembling fingers. Vivian's hands shook as she bent forward awkwardly, her pregnant belly making the simple task nearly impossible. The evening had started like so many others, Charles choosing the restaurant, ordering for both of them, spending the first course detailing her failures as a wife and soon-to-be mother. "Happy anniversary to us," Charles murmured, taking a sip of wine worth more than most people's weekly salary. That was when she had made her fatal mistake. Instead of nodding and apologizing like months of systematic conditioning had trained her to do, Vivian had found a spark of her old self buried beneath layers of fear. "I am not your employee, Charles. I am your wife, and I deserve some consideration and respect." The words had hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before his palm found her cheek. Now, as she finally managed to retrieve her glasses with the help of a concerned waiter, Vivian became aware of the phones pointed in their direction. In an age where everything was recorded and shared instantly, Charles had just destroyed any chance of maintaining his carefully crafted public image. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized he didn't care. The mask had finally slipped completely. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance," Charles announced to the room, his voice carrying practiced authority. "My wife is having some difficulty with pregnancy hormones. I'm sure you all understand." The collective intake of breath was audible. Even in a room full of wealthy, powerful people accustomed to overlooking uncomfortable truths, Charles had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Several women pushed back from their tables, hands moving protectively to their own bellies. Vivian felt the familiar shame washing over her, the voice Charles had carefully cultivated telling her this was somehow her fault. But the baby kicked again, harder this time, and something deeper than fear stirred in her chest. This tiny person growing inside her didn't deserve to enter a world where violence was explained away as hormonal difficulties. That was when she noticed him approaching their table. Clayton Mitchell Grace moved through the dining room with the purposeful stride of someone who had navigated war zones and hostile territory. At 32, her older brother still carried himself like the Navy SEAL he had been before trading his military career for Chef White's and a dream. His dark hair was shorter than regulation but longer than he'd worn overseas, and his green eyes held the kind of focused intensity that made smart people step aside and stupid people make very bad decisions. Clay had built Coastal Kitchen from nothing, transforming a rundown seafood shack into the most prestigious restaurant on the Central Coast through sheer force of will and culinary genius. He treated his staff like family, his customers like honored guests, and his sister like the most precious thing in his world. Tonight he looked like he was preparing for war. "Vivian," Clay said softly as he reached their table, his voice carrying the controlled calm that any veteran would recognize as a warning signal. His eyes moved quickly over her reddened cheek, her trembling hands, her defensive posture cataloging evidence, with the efficiency of someone trained to assess threats. "Clayton, how wonderful to see you," Charles replied smoothly, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. "Congratulations on another excellent meal, though I have to say the service has been somewhat lacking tonight." Clay's gaze never left his sister's face. "Vivian, are you all right?" The simple question, asked with such gentle concern, nearly broke her resolve to hold everything together. Clay had always been her protector, teaching her to ride a bike, scaring away bullies, walking her down the aisle because no one else could have filled that role. "She's fine," Charles answered for her, his tone sharp with ownership. "And I would appreciate you returning to your kitchen so we can finish our anniversary dinner in peace." Something shifted in Clay's expression, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that Vivian had seen only once before during their father's funeral, when a drunk mourner made inappropriate comments about their mother's grief. "Sir," Clay said, and the single word contained volumes of restrained violence, "I wasn't speaking to you." Charles set down his fork with deliberate precision, the small clink somehow more ominous than if he had thrown it. "Excuse me, did you just tell me what I can and cannot say about my own wife?" Clay's hands remained steady at his sides, but Vivian could see the subtle shift in his stance, the way his weight balanced on the balls of his feet like he was preparing to move. "I asked my sister a question. I'd like to hear her answer." "Your sister?" Charles laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Let me explain something to you, Chef. When a woman gets married, she becomes part of her husband's family. Her loyalty, her obedience, her very identity belongs to him. Vivian is my wife, which means she answers to me, not to some glorified short-order cook." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Vivian watched her brother's face, seeing the muscle in his jaw twitch once, twice, before going perfectly still. "Charles, please," Vivian whispered. "Let's just go home." "We're not going anywhere," he snapped, turning his attention back to her with renewed viciousness. "You wanted to make a scene in front of your brother, fine. Let him see exactly what kind of wife he raised you to be." Charles leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the now silent restaurant. "You've been nothing but a disappointment since the day I married you. Weak, emotional, constantly complaining. I thought pregnancy might make you more grateful, more feminine, but instead you've become even more pathetic." Each word hit Vivian like a physical blow designed to strip away whatever confidence she had managed to gather. She could feel the baby moving restlessly inside her, responding to her stress. "You think carrying my child gives you some kind of power over me?" Charles continued, his voice growing louder. "Let me remind you of something, sweetheart. I own you. I own this pathetic little life you think you've built. And when this baby comes, I'll own them too." "That's enough." Clay's voice cut through Charles's tirade like a blade. Charles straightened in his chair, his face flushing with indignation. "I beg your pardon. I said that's enough." Clay took a single step closer, and somehow that small movement seemed to fill the entire space with potential violence. "You will not speak to my sister that way in my restaurant or anywhere else." "Your restaurant?" Charles laughed again, pulling out his phone. "Do you have any idea who I am? What I could do to this little vanity project with a single phone call? I have connections you can't imagine. I could have this place shut down by morning." Clay moved closer, each step measured and deliberate. Other diners were no longer pretending to eat, phones out and recording as the confrontation escalated. "You know what I think," Clay said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "I think you've never been in a fight in your entire life. I think you've spent so many years picking on people who can't fight back that you've forgotten what real danger looks like." Charles shot to his feet so quickly his chair toppled backward. "How dare you? Do you know who my family is?" "People who've actually fought for something that mattered," Clay asked, close enough now that Charles had to look up to meet his gaze. "People who know the difference between real strength and the pathetic power trips of spoiled children?" "Here's what's going to happen," Clay said quietly. "You're going to apologize to my sister. You're going to leave this restaurant and you're never going to touch her again." Charles's face had gone purple with rage. "You can't tell me what to do. She's my wife. My property." The admission was captured by a dozen phones uploaded to social media before Charles realized what he had said. "Property," Clay repeated, and now his voice carried something that made several people push back from their tables. That was when Charles made his final fatal mistake. Perhaps it was the wine or the adrenaline or simply a lifetime of never facing consequences, but he reached out and pushed Clay's chest with both hands. "Get away from us, you worthless piece of trash." Clay didn't move. Charles might as well have been pushing against a mountain. But something in the restaurant's atmosphere changed, like the moment before lightning strikes. Clay looked down at the hands pressed against his chest, then back up at Charles's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but carried to every corner of the room. "Sir, you have just made the biggest mistake of your life." For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the entire restaurant held its breath. Clay stared down at Charles's hands pressed against his chest, then slowly, deliberately looked back up into the other man's face. Charles, perhaps finally realizing he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, tried to step backward. But Clay's hand moved with liquid precision, closing around Charles's wrist with controlled strength that spoke of years of training. "Remove your hands," Clay said quietly, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "Now." The word hit Charles like a physical blow. Whatever bravado he had summoned evaporated as he found himself unable to break free from the iron grip. For the first time in his privileged life, Charles Edward Whitmore III was physically overpowered by someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his name. "Let go of me," Charles demanded, but his voice cracked. "This is assault." "You put your hands on me first," Clay replied matter-of-factly, still holding Charles's wrist with effortless strength. "In front of 50 witnesses, after striking my pregnant sister in my restaurant, I'd say my response has been remarkably restrained." Travis Burns emerged from the kitchen, then moving with the same purposeful efficiency as Clay. At 29, Travis had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining Clay in civilian life. He positioned himself strategically near the kitchen entrance, ready to provide backup. "Everything all right out here, Chef?" Travis asked, using the tone that indicated he already knew everything was decidedly not all right. "Just having a conversation with Mr. Whitmore about restaurant etiquette," Clay replied without taking his eyes off Charles. "He seems to be having difficulty understanding basic concepts of respect." Maureen Kelly, the restaurant manager, had been watching from the hostess stand. At 45, she had seen every type of difficult customer, but nothing had prepared her for this. She had already called the police. "Mr. Grace," she called out, "the authorities are on their way." Charles's face went pale as the implications hit him. Police meant reports. Reports meant records, and records meant his carefully maintained public image would be shattered beyond repair. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, finally managing to pull his wrist free. "I was defending myself against this maniac." "Actually," said a clear voice from a nearby table, "I recorded the entire incident. Would you like me to play it back?" The speaker was an elderly woman dining alone, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes sharp with intelligence. She held up her phone with the confidence of someone who had witnessed injustice and refused to let it stand. "As did I," added another diner, a young man who looked like a journalist. "Posted it live to my social media accounts. 60,000 followers so far, growing by the minute." The color drained entirely from Charles's face as he realized the scope of his exposure. In the age of viral videos, his moment of uncontrolled rage had just been broadcast to the world. Clay stepped closer and Charles instinctively backed away, bumping into the overturned chair. "Here's what you clearly don't understand. I spent 8 years in the Navy SEALs. I've been trained to neutralize threats with maximum efficiency. Right now, you represent a clear and present danger to my sister and her unborn child." Clay's voice never rose above conversational level, but something in his tone made everyone understand they were witnessing a predator deciding whether to attack. "The only reason you're still conscious is because I choose to let you remain so. But understand this very clearly: if you ever lay a hand on my sister again, I will forget about legal consequences and civilian rules of engagement." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that several diners actually pushed back from their tables. Charles tried to speak but found his voice gone. "Do you understand me?" Clay asked. Charles nodded wordlessly. "Good. Now you're going to apologize to my sister and then you're going to leave." Vivian had been sitting frozen throughout the confrontation, her hands pressed protectively over her pregnant belly. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been all evening. "Charles, I think you should leave." He turned to look at her, his face a mask of confusion and rage. "You're taking his side against your own husband." "I'm taking the side of someone who has never hit me," Vivian replied, and the simple statement carried more weight than any accusation. The sound of sirens could be heard approaching. Charles looked around the restaurant one final time, seeing only hostile faces and recording devices. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking. "You have no idea what you've started here." Clay smiled then, and it wasn't pleasant. "Actually, I have a very good idea what you're capable of. I've seen you in action tonight. What I'm curious about is whether you understand what I'm capable of." Charles had no answer. As the police sirens grew louder, he turned and walked quickly toward the exit, leaving behind his wife, his reputation, and any pretense that he was anything other than a coward. But as he reached the door, he turned back one final time, his eyes finding Vivian across the crowded dining room. "This isn't over," he repeated, and this time the threat was unmistakable. "Not by a long shot." Detective Vernon Walsh arrived at Coastal Kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working domestic violence cases for 2 decades. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a veteran who had seen humanity at its worst and still chose to fight for its best. Walsh understood exactly what he was looking at when he saw Clay standing protectively near his sister's table. Military bearing was unmistakable, especially in a crisis situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Walsh announced, "I'm Detective Walsh with the County Sheriff's Department. I understand there was an incident here tonight." Maureen approached immediately. "Detective, I called 911 after witnessing Mr. Whitmore strike his pregnant wife. The entire incident was captured on our security cameras." Walsh's eyes moved to Vivian, who was still seated at the table, one hand pressed to her reddened cheek. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to speak with you about what happened." Vivian looked up with eyes that held fear, shame, and something that might have been hope. "It wasn't that bad," she said automatically. "He was upset about something, and I probably shouldn't have talked back." "Ma'am," Walsh interrupted gently, "you have a handprint on your face and 50 people witnessed your husband strike you. There's no misunderstanding here." Clay stepped forward. Detective, my name is Clayton Grace. This is my restaurant and Vivian is my sister. What we witnessed tonight wasn't a misunderstanding, it was assault by a man with a documented history of intimidation. That was when Dorothy Grace arrived, bursting through the front door with the focused determination of a mother whose child was in danger. At 58, Dorothy retained the brisk efficiency of her nursing career and the fierce protectiveness that came from raising two children largely alone. "Where is she?" Dorothy demanded, scanning the restaurant until she found Vivian. "Oh, honey, what did he do to you?" The appearance of her mother seemed to break something in Vivian's carefully maintained composure. For the first time since the slap, tears began to flow as she stood and moved into Dorothy's embrace. "I'm sorry," Vivian whispered. "I should have been more careful, shouldn't have made him angry." "Stop," Dorothy said firmly. "This is not your fault. Nothing you said justifies what happened here tonight." That was when Vivian suddenly gasped and doubled over, her hands clutching her abdomen as sharp pain shot through her midsection. The baby, which had been moving restlessly all evening, suddenly went completely still. "Something's wrong," Vivian said, fear evident in her voice. "The baby, something's wrong with the baby." Clay was at her side, instantly supporting her weight. "We need to get her to the hospital now." Dorothy was already moving. "My car's right outside. The hospital is only 5 minutes away." As Clay scooped Vivian into his arms, Walsh called after them. "Mrs. Whitmore, we still need to discuss what happened here tonight. This investigation isn't going away." Vivian looked back over Clay's shoulder, her face pale with pain. "I understand, Detective. But right now, I need to make sure my baby is all right." They were almost to the exit when Charles reappeared, flanked by a woman in an expensive suit who could only be his lawyer. Eleanor Blake Whitmore shared her brother's aristocratic features but carried herself with sharp competence. "Where do you think you're going with my client's wife?" Eleanor demanded, stepping into their path. Clay didn't slow down. He simply adjusted his grip on Vivian and continued moving with implacable momentum. "Get out of my way," he said quietly, and something in his tone made Eleanor step aside despite her legal training. Charles, emboldened by his sister's presence, tried one final power play. "Vivian, you'll come home with me right now. We can handle this medical situation privately." Vivian lifted her head from Clay's shoulder and looked directly at her husband. When she spoke, her voice was weak from pain, but absolutely clear in its resolve. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Charles. I'm going to the hospital to make sure our baby is safe, and then I'm going to decide what happens next. But I will never put myself or this child in a position where you can hurt us again." The words hit Charles like a physical blow. For the first time since the incident began, he seemed to understand that his actions might have consequences beyond legal troubles. He might actually lose control of his wife, his child, and the carefully constructed life that depended on his ability to dominate. As they reached the parking lot, Vivian was hit by another wave of pain strong enough to make her cry out. The baby remained ominously still. "Drive fast, Mom," Clay said as he gently placed Vivian in the back seat. "I think we might be running out of time." Behind them, Charles stood in the restaurant doorway, watching the car disappear into the night and realizing that his world as he knew it was ending. Tomorrow the videos would be everywhere. His family would demand explanations he couldn't provide. His business associates would distance themselves from the scandal. And somewhere in the chaos of consequences, he had lost the only real power he had ever possessed: his wife's fear. Detective Walsh remained in the restaurant, methodically collecting evidence and witness statements, building a case that would ensure Charles Edward Whitmore III faced justice. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's incident was just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. In his experience, men like Charles didn't simply accept defeat and move on. They escalated. They retaliated. They found new ways to hurt the people who had dared to stand up to them. and somewhere in the night a decorated Navy SEAL was preparing to protect his family by any means necessary. The emergency room crisis had passed. Dr. Sarah Chen's quick intervention had stopped the premature labor, and Isabella Grace Morrison, named for Dorothy's mother and carrying the Grace family name by choice, had been born healthy at full term 3 months later. Now Vivian sat in the nursery of her own home, a modest 3-bedroom craftsman she'd purchased with settlement money, finally living the independent life she'd never been allowed to imagine during her marriage. Isabella, now 3 months old, slept peacefully in her arms while afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked a garden Vivian had planted herself. Clay stood by the window, his expression soft with wonder as he watched his niece. "She looks like you did as a baby. Same stubborn chin." The criminal trial had concluded 2 months earlier with guilty verdicts on all charges. Charles Edward Whitmore III was serving 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 5 years of probation and mandatory counseling. More importantly, the civil settlement had ensured Vivian's financial independence and Isabella's future security. "Any word from Eleanor?" Vivian asked, adjusting Isabella's blanket. "She sent flowers," Dorothy replied from the doorway, indicating an elaborate arrangement. "The card says she hopes you and Isabella will have the peaceful, happy life you both deserve." Eleanor Blake Whitmore had proven an unexpected ally during the final weeks of legal proceedings. Her testimony about Charles's escalating threats had been crucial in securing his conviction. The experience had cost her professionally. Several corporate clients had dropped her firm. But she had told the prosecutor that some things mattered more than billable hours. "Travis brought lunch from the restaurant," Clay said, indicating a basket of carefully prepared meals. "And Jack and Danny wanted me to tell you that Isabella officially has 3 honorary uncles." Vivian laughed, the sound light and genuine in a way that had been missing from her voice for years. "Please tell them that my daughter will be learning age-appropriate skills like reading and recognizing healthy relationships." "Ooh, we'll compromise," Clay replied with a grin. "Reading first motorcycle maintenance when she turned 16. Dr. Chen entered with Vivian's discharge paperwork from Isabella's latest checkup. "Everything looks perfect. You're both thriving." The name change had been finalized weeks earlier, Vivian legally returning to her maiden name and ensuring Isabella would carry the Grace family legacy rather than the Whitmore burden. Clay's phone buzzed with a message from Detective Walsh. "Charles filed an appeal this morning. Legal experts say it has virtually no chance of success, but thought you should know." Clay showed the message to Vivian, who read it with the calm attention of someone who had learned to face bad news without panic. "He's never going to stop completely, is he?" she asked. "Probably not," Clay admitted. "But he's facing consequences now, and his pattern of violence is part of the public record. Any future incidents will be taken seriously." Dorothy settled into the rocking chair beside them. "Besides, he'll have other things to worry about. I heard his family's investment firm is facing SEC investigation." Clay hadn't asked what information Jack and Danny had provided to federal authorities, but he suspected Charles's legal troubles extended far beyond domestic violence charges. The Whitmore family's decades of covering up problems had finally attracted the attention of investigators who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Where to now?" Dorothy asked. "Home," Vivian said simply. "Our home." As afternoon faded into evening, Vivian found herself in Isabella's nursery, rocking her daughter while watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The house was quiet except for the gentle sounds of a peaceful evening. No raised voices, no walking on eggshells, no fear of saying the wrong thing. Isabella stirred in her arms, dark eyes opening to focus on her mother's face with the intense attention of someone discovering the world. "Welcome to the world, baby girl," Vivian whispered. "You're going to do amazing things." Clay appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of tea. "How are my girls?" "Perfect," Vivian replied, accepting the warm mug gratefully. "We're absolutely perfect." Through the window, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its waves carrying away the last remnants of a painful chapter and washing the shore clean for whatever came next. At Coastal Kitchen, the dinner crowd gathered to celebrate another successful evening, unaware that their chef had just begun the most important job of his life, teaching his niece that she deserved a world where love meant safety, where family meant protection, and where strength was measured not by the ability to control others, but by the courage to stand up for what was right. Charles Edward Whitmore III would serve his sentence and face whatever consequences his choices had earned. But in a quiet nursery overlooking a peaceful neighborhood, 3 generations of the Grace family had already won the only victory that truly mattered: the right to build a future free from fear, filled with love and defined by the unshakable certainty that some things, family, truth, and the protection of the innocent, were worth fighting for with everything you had. The war was over, the healing had begun, and Isabella Grace Morrison slept peacefully in her mother's arms, dreaming of a world where she would never doubt her right to be safe, loved, and free.